Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started with the second session of today, which is invasive plants, developments in research and management. So I'm going to pass it over to our session moderator, Darissa.
Thanks, Mackenzie, and good morning. I hope everyone enjoyed learning about the great developments in research and management being done in forest invasives this morning so far. And if you missed it, don't worry, it'll be available on our YouTube page in the next couple of weeks. Now we're moving into session 2B, invasive plants development and research and management. My name is Darissa Vincentini, and I'm the community action leader at the Invasive Species Center. And like Mackenzie said, I will be moderating this session. I would like to take a quick moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Sault Ste. Marie or Bawating in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, home of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the Métis Nation. We have 4 great presenters in this session, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions after each presenter. So please just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose any of your questions and avoid posting them in the chat. So now let's give a warm welcome to our first presenter, Michael Mctavish, for the first topic, a second wave of earthworm invasions, ecological and management implications of jumping worms in Southern Ontario. Michael Mctavish is a MITAX Elevate postdoctoral research fellow working in the Smith Forest Health Lab at the University of Toronto and Ducks Unlimited Canada. His current research includes biological control of non-native invasive plants, Phragmites and garlic mustard, and the ecology of non-native earthworms. So welcome, Michael.
Great, thanks very much. I'm gonna pull these slides up here. Looking good?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much. So good morning, everyone. Glad you're able to join us here. I'm going to start off this invasive plant session with talking about something that is categorically not an invasive plant, but that is sort of adjacent to that subject area. And I'm actually going to be presenting on behalf of a research student who's actually done a lot of this work herself, Esther Tang, and then colleagues Sandy Smith and Rob Boucher. So as was noted in that introduction, a lot of our main work these days is actually focused on biological control. So for myself, I'm involved in biocontrol work looking at introduced Phragmites and garlic mustard, as was mentioned. Not going to be talking about those right now. If you'd like to hear more about those systems and others, I would refer you to a talk this afternoon that my colleague Rob Boucher will be giving, so do check that out. What we're going to be talking about today, however, is a little bit different, and we're going to be looking at worms. So again, a lot of this comes from Esther Tang's work. She's an undergraduate research student at the University of Toronto who we've been supervising. Most earthworms that we have in Canada are non-native European species. So they're part of this global invasion process. They're spreading around the world, and you can find them on every continent except for Antarctica. We're interested in worms, and especially non-native worms, because they are really influential ecosystem engineers. So when they move into a habitat, they will first and foremost dramatically alter the soil profile that is present. And this can go on to have cascading effects on various soil organisms, on vegetation in the understory and the overstory, overall function, productivity, and so on. When we talk about earthworm invasion, often what we have been talking about is this first wave of invasion. This has been the movement of species from mostly Europe, from as early as the 1500s with early European settlers. But increasingly what we're seeing is this so-called second wave of invasion. So this is the movement of species from Asia. It's more recent, dating more to the mid-20th century, and it's becoming more common now. We're referring here to 16 different species of ferritomoid earthworms. They're from 12 different genera that are native to East and Southeast Asia. One thing about these taxa is that you'll hear them referred to by many different common names. Most commonly here is probably jumping worms, and that's what we'll call them, but you may also hear them referred to as snake worms, crazy worms, or other things as well. How do they differ from European earthworms? Because they do in a number of different regards. They are primarily very shallow burrowing, so you find them really just in the top few centimeters of soil. They don't go particularly deep. And many are parthenogenetic, so they're able to reproduce on their own, which makes them very adept at creating new populations from a small number of individuals. They have a very curious annual life cycle in contrast with most European earthworms. So they reproduce very, very rapidly, and then they will die off by winter, and they overwinter as cocoons. So overall, these are invaders that can set up shop really rapidly and have these dramatic impacts on soil structure and function. And one of the reasons for this is it's sort of an interesting aspect that has to do with mass and density. So if we think of our really large European earthworms, so dew worms or night crawlers, those really good bait worms, they're large, but you tend to find them at very low density. The European species that we find at high density, they tend to be really quite small. Jumping worms break this pattern by being both large-bodied and occurring at high population densities, and accordingly, they can have these really dramatic impacts on invaded ecosystems. As with so many invasive species, they're very closely tied to human activity. These tend to move around largely with the horticultural trade. So adult worms and worm cocoons are transported in mulch, in soil, and potted plants and can be moved between continents and all over the country. This has largely been an American problem, so they're now found in an estimated 38 American states. We hadn't really had them in Canada. There were a couple of very isolated collections made near Windsor, very close to the border in 2014 by noted earthworm taxonomist John Reynolds, but really that had been it. And that is now different, unfortunately. So my involvement in this project started this summer when folks started coming to us with reports of kind of unusual earthworms in their gardens at their homes. These were mostly coming from Master Gardeners of Ontario participants, so folks who really know their soil and are used to paying attention to what's going on there. So we really appreciate that attentiveness. I was able to go out and investigate some of these reports, and sure enough, there were our first kind of substantial sightings of jumping worms in Canada and in Ontario specifically. So working with John Reynolds, we very quickly sort of ID'd and wrote up sort of a quick paper on this, basically saying that they're here now. If we pull a map from that paper that shows those sightings, essentially what we see here are those samples included 4 different jumping worm species. These are fairly common ones in the States, so sort of no big surprises in terms of what we found. Nothing super rare, but these were the first substantial sightings in Canada. So we know that they're here. The question is, what do we do next? And we had our main work on the go, sort of only so much time and resources to allocate to this, but this was the first sighting of this really important invasion. So we didn't want to have it totally pass us by. So that's where we were able to get Esther involved as a research student addressing some of these questions. And the main question we want to look at is essentially, where are they? What is the current distribution of jumping worms, focusing on southern Ontario in scale? There were 2 main project components to this. The first was to continue collecting as many of these sort of community science-based observations as we could to cover more ground. And the second was to take a more local look and conduct a systematic survey of some of Toronto's ravine systems. The first element I want to look at is those community science observations, and this has been a really great tool for expanding our reach. I will note that this work is still ongoing, so a lot of these findings are preliminary, and this is just kind of what we've found so far. Once we knew that we had them here, I did up a very quick info sheet with some details and some diagnostic characteristics to help ID them in the field. We distributed this within a fairly small kind of local network, and we asked people to provide photos or videos to help give a tentative idea of what we were looking at, descriptions of the habitat, where they think they may have come from, and how long ago they think they might have first seen this. So to date, we've got, we actually got a few new ones recently, so now 23, but at the time 21 observations. Thankfully, we were able to confirm most of these with either specimens or photos or videos, so we know what we're looking at. Mostly these samples are coming from residential outdoor gardens, which makes sense given how jumping worms move around, but we are also seeing them in public parks and arboretums and that sort of thing. Someone even reported finding jumping worms in a potted plant within their home as well, and they're kind of upset by that. Some of the good news is that most of these observations seem to be relatively recent. So some people think they may have seen something similar in past years, but that's difficult to judge. Most are saying this is the first year that they've seen anything like this. So it seems to be a relatively recent phenomenon. If we map those out, we have samples that we have confirmed IDs for in black, photo and video ID in blue, unconfirmed in yellow-green. We can see a few patterns jump out here. As would be expected, these sightings have been largely concentrated around Toronto and Hamilton, though we do have some outlying observations as well, including new sightings from close to that original Windsor site where those 2014 samples came from. We also have really big gaps, and these don't have observations. So that doesn't mean that jumping worms aren't there. It just means we don't know. And so filling in some of these gaps one way or the other is one of our priorities going forward. So while doing some of these sort of initial site visits to these gardens, I noticed in back of those houses there are these ravines, and sort of a quick walk into one of them very quickly confirmed, unfortunately, that jumping worms in that case had at least made their way into this more semi-natural environment, which is really what we're concerned about in the big picture. So we want to take a look at this more closely. So this element of the project has been looking at the local distribution of jumping worms in the Toronto ravine system. So for those not familiar with Toronto, we're fortunate to have this really nice network of ravines running throughout the city, which gives us lots of different locations that we can go to and sample. So the first of two main project components here was a geographic survey looking at 11 different ravines through the Toronto area to survey for jumping worm presence. We used a fairly rapid assessment tool, mostly a visual survey, just walking the main path, looking for earthworm casts, worms, quick assessments of vegetation cover. We also dropped a few random quadrats at certain points to get more detailed information as well. This was then paired with a seasonal survey. So I mentioned jumping worms are annual in their life cycle, so we wanted to know when do they start to disappear in the fall. So to do this, Esther's been doing these weekly samplings at the same ravine at the same locations, and collecting some information to see when they drop off. So if we take a look at some of these preliminary results, again noting that they are preliminary and there's more to come here. Sort of the course level of this is essentially that of those 11 ravines, we found jumping worms in 4 of them, which is kind of sort of a good news, bad news. They're not everywhere, but they have spread around to a few different locations in these more natural areas, which is not what we want. Within the locations where they are present, we see a lot of variation. So these dots represent those sampling points along those visual surveys walking that main path. When it's black, we didn't see evidence of jumping worms. When it's yellow, we did. So some of the sites had very low occupancy, so about 5%, for example, and then some were extremely high. So if we look at the bottom, that's about 94%. This site was completely inundated, which was really sort of startling to see. So a lot of variation between locations. And you'll note in both of these images here how close these trails are to those houses as well. And we're really looking at that as probably being the main source of introduction into these locations. So garden material making its way into the ravines. So from the seasonal survey, looking at when earthworms start to disappear, we can plot jumping worm density in the green bars here. We'll have soil temperature in blue. We know from other research that they sort of start to become less active and eventually die off when the soil temperature is below 5 degrees. And our observations largely sort of fit with that idea as well. So as the soil gets colder, we start to see less and less activity. And again, there are other sampling going on looking at cocoon density, earthworm biomass, other identifications. So there will be more on this to come soon. So to give a quick summary of what we're seeing here, what do we know at this point? The big one is, of course, that jumping worms are present at multiple locations in Ontario, and we're looking at least 4 species, potentially more. Our evidence suggests this is a probably relatively recent invasion, but it's also not brand new. We just sort of hadn't noticed it before, hadn't been looking for it before. They're very abundant in gardens, which is how they spread, but they're also making their way into more natural areas, which is a bigger problem. And when we look at various scales, they are not ubiquitous, but at the same time, not rare either. So what happens next in terms of follow-up research? Some of the priorities for us and hopefully other people working on this in the future will be distribution. The big thing is to really find out where are they and what do they do? Locally, what are their impacts on soil biodiversity? Erosion is a big concern in the ravines, for example. How do they interact with European earthworms as a part of these ecosystems? And how do they move around through pathways of spread? If we take a quick look at what you can do, the big thing to know is that they are here now. So here, in this case, is Toronto, but we also have colleagues who have reports of jumping worms potentially out in the Atlantic provinces. And realistically, once you start looking in other places, you're probably going to start finding them now or in the near future. So be aware of that. What to look for, there are really diagnostic features. Fortunately, they're pretty easy to tell apart from a lot of European earthworms once you know what to look for. Morphologically, they have this really milky ring-like clitellum near their head that runs all the way around. They tend to be smoother and shinier. They have this really distinctive thrashing behavior from which they get their name, and they tend to drop their tail, certain species, if disturbed. Even if you don't see the worms themselves, their cast, the waste material, is very distinctive. So jumping worms leave this really loose, crumbly coffee ground-like material in contrast with the smoother, patchier European worm casts. Overall, large-scale control is really not possible at this point. We don't have any tools to do that, but at the same time, we don't want to help spread it around, and we want to slow down the rate of spread. So if you have jumping worms, refrain from moving mulch, soil, plants from invaded areas elsewhere. At very small scales, control may be possible by bagging up material or solarizing it, because we know that kills the worms and their cocoons. But really, the main thing is on focusing on dispersal limitation. If you want more information on this, you can check out the new jumping worm profile at the Invasive Species Center website, and the link is there. Again, knowing where they are is the big thing, so reporting sightings through EDMAPS is our best tool to do that right now. And if you think you have jumping worms or have questions about this or interested in incorporating this into your monitoring that you're doing, please get in touch as well. And just to wrap up here, finally, as we know with invasive species, early detection and rapid responses is really essential. And so for jumping worms, that's where we're at right now. And that makes this a really critical window of time. Seeing it for the first time here with these really dramatic ecological impacts is quite scary. But at the same time, we do know pretty early that they're here and they're easy to monitor, which I think also gives us a lot of hope. So there's going to be more on this from us and from others in years to come. So do stay tuned and pay attention to this story, because this is a really important change that's coming to our soils. So thank you very much to our many collaborators and supporters on this, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. That's very interesting. We do have a couple questions here. Are there any predators of these jumping worms? That is, do birds or small rodents eat them? And do we know that in North America?
Yep. Yeah, so because we've had these sort of since mid-20th century in the States anyway, we have some of this information. You know, everything that you would expect that would eat a worm does tend to go after them, though they are a little bit different sort of behaviorally, so there's some difference there. In terms of really specialist predators, we don't see too much of that. There is interest in potential biological control for jumping worms and European earthworms. So flatworms, ants, some parasitoids are sort of under study, but really that's at a theoretical experimental stage right now.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. There are a couple other questions in the Q&A as well as one in the chat, but I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next speaker, but feel free to answer those in the Q&A box.
Will do. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. All right. So next, I'm excited to introduce Christopher Evans. He will be presenting Species on the Move, Emerging Invasive Plant Species that are actively expanding their range. Christopher Evans is an extension, forestry, and research specialist with the University of Illinois Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. Chris specializes in forest management and restoration, forest health, and invasive species. He is currently a board member of the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, co-chair of the Illinois Invasive Species Council's Committee of Terrestrial Invasive Plants, and associate editor of the Natural Areas Journal. Chris is a past vice president of the National Association of Invasive Plant Council and a past secretary treasurer of the North American Invasive Species Management Association. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks. Can you see my slides now?
Yep, it looks great.
Great, thanks a bunch. So I wanted to today really to just talk about a handful of plants that I'm seeing actively spread their range and move north. And so these are ones that are I would say to keep an eye out on in the future. If you don't already have them, you may be getting them soon. So I'll just hit 5 plants that I think are priorities, and just kind of briefly mention each one and how to identify them, and then just hit right at the end on why we need to report them and look for them. But again, you know, these are relatively rare in the landscape in Canada, moving into northern United States, ones that I would imagine they would either in low densities currently now, or we're going to basically arrive in the near future. And as we've all seen this invasion curve, we're trying to identify these and find them at the low end of that curve where eradication or at least management is easier, and we have a higher chance of success. So the first that I want to mention is Japanese chaff flower. This is, it's in the amaranth family. It's an Acranthes. This was first found in the early 80s in the southern Appalachians in the eastern US. It has since spread throughout the Ohio River Valley, much of the southeastern United States, and the lower Midwest. And they recently found kind of a huge jump in its range into southern Ontario. And so this is spread by birds. It could be spread by animals, by people. So there's really a high potential for it to show up even long distances from where we know it's at. So just a bit about chaff flower and identification. This is a perennial herbaceous forb, 2 to 5 feet tall. I have seen it a bit taller. Older plants tend to have multiple stems. When they're younger, the first year or two, they usually just have 1 stem. As they get older, you'll have 3 or 4 or more stems coming out from the base. And then in the fall, or the winter, they'll have bright tan thatch that the stems will stay up, so you can identify this even into the winter time. They flower late summer, early fall, and they tend to have these green compact spikes of bottle brush-like flowers. The leaves are opposite and have arching venation. They're entire, and then the nodes on the stems tend to have a lot of a reddish color. It really doesn't stand out, honestly. It looks like a lot of other plants. When it does flower, though, and especially when it produces its fruit, that's really where you can pick it out. Those bottle brush flowers start on the spikes very, very compact. As they start developing into fruit, those stems really elongate, and they can get very long. And then the fruit tend to mature and then deflex along the stem and lay flat along the stem. And if you can see the fruit on that picture on the right, you can see that each one has a pair of sharp barbs that come from the base of the fruit, and that allows that to basically hang on to fur, hang on to clothes, move around that way. So it's very easily spread and picked up that way. In the fall, as these spikes mature and the fruit get on there, the plant becomes a lot more recognizable just by the texture of it, with all of the fruiting spikes sticking out at the top of the plant. Again, it's mostly concentrated here in the Ohio River Valley, kind of in the upper southeast or lower Midwest of the United States. But then just recently finding a population in southern Ontario kind of helped us realize that this really does have the potential to spread quickly. And there's an interesting article about that find in Ontario if you're interested in it, from the Canadian Field Naturalist. Chaff flower tends to prefer moist, well-drained, rich bottomland soils, so you'll find it in riparian areas and bottomland forest, though it doesn't like its feet very wet, so you won't find it in true wetlands or places that have long periods of inundation. Even though it prefers that, we're finding that it can grow basically nearly anywhere. We find it growing in cracks in concrete, on the top of bluffs, very dry areas as well. It tends to be moderately shade tolerant, though it does prefer edge habitats with partial sun. You can find it growing anywhere from deep shade to full sun. Most often you'll find this in disturbed sites first, so roadsides, fence rows, edges of yards, flower beds, old fields, and then from there it tends to move into more kind of higher quality natural areas. The next would be Japanese stilt grass, also called brown top or packing grass. This is an annual warm season shade tolerant grass. It's been in North America for a long time. I think it was first found in 1919 down in Tennessee, but it is still actively spreading its range, particularly moving north. This is a weak-rooted annual. It has short aerial roots. These stilted roots is where it gets its name, stilt grass. And because of this weak rootedness, it pulls up very easily. And that's a good identification tip, because there are some native grasses that look somewhat like this, but they tend to be perennials. So grabbing the plant and giving a little tug, if it pulls up very easily, it's a good indication that it may be stilt grass. A couple meters tall at times, though it does tend to have sprawling, weak stems. So the plant doesn't usually stand up when it's that long. It tends to flop over or prop itself up on other vegetation. The leaves overall are short and wide, with a whitish midrib, that whitish or silvery midrib that may be visible down the middle of the plant. The flowers, this also flowers in late summer or early fall. And the flowers usually aren't very visible for that long. They'll produce the flowers, and then as the fruit gets set, it weighs it down, and then the flower spike kind of falls down into the plant. But they'll have 1 to 2 or 3 branched, long, wiry racemes. That's usually not very visible. Again, mostly you're looking at leaf characteristics and then just overall plant characteristics. But you can see this kind of sprawling nature of it, the weak stems. It tends to flop over, lay over like that, particularly as it gets longer. And then you can kind of see the short, fat blades with the somewhat whitish midribs. And then again, if you pull it up, it has these little stilted aerial roots at the base of the plant. Again, it's an annual. It does tend to germinate kind of later in the spring, and then it being a C4 grass, it really puts on a lot of its growth mid to late summer into again early fall. So that's where it really puts a lot of its biomass on. You can see very, very well established in the eastern United States. The Michigan populations, the Wisconsin populations, the Iowa populations there in the upper Midwest have all been very recent pines. So it does appear to be actively still moving north. We don't really know a lot about its cold tolerance at this time, though it appears to be doing fine in those populations. So I would imagine that right now it's just simply time to move north. It's not found that cold boundary for the north, so it may just continue to spread. Definitely one to keep an eye out on. Very, very damaging in ecosystems where it's found. It does also prefer moist forests and partial to full sun, similar to chaff flower, though it can grow in deep shade. It usually has somewhat reduced seed production in those deeper shade environments. This one responds very aggressively to disturbance. So any kind of wind damage, storm damage, logging, prescribed fires, anything that disturbs the soil or lets a little light into the ecosystem, we often see very, very strong responses from stiltgrass where they can just explode. The population can explode. Also, the small seeds tend to be very easily transported on equipment, shoes, horses, and so forth. So it is another one that can spread around very quickly by human activities. The next is Collary Pear. So this is one you're probably familiar with. It's a very common ornamental called Bradford Pear. There's a bunch of different varieties. Small to medium-sized deciduous tree. It's escaping cultivation and really causing forming huge populations now in much of the upper Midwest and throughout the East. The white flowers in the spring that bloom before the leaves emerge make this a fairly easy plant to identify, particularly in the early spring. Wide, rounded, or somewhat triangular leaves that are dark green. The escape populations of Collary Pear usually form short spurs or thorns on the plant. It almost makes it look like a plum species, but it has large, fuzzy terminal buds, small, brown, rough, rounded fruit, and then really dark gray bark that becomes rough and fissured with age. So it looks a bit different. Even the leaves look a bit different on the escape versions from the ornamental varieties. They tend to be smaller, a little more triangular. But you can see those short spurs that are tipped with thorns, and then the fuzzy buds are really stand out. It's a plant that pretty easy to identify once you get to see it. Early spring, white flowering trees along the roadside are really what makes it easy to pick out. And you can see kind of really scattered populations moving around, but it does seem to escape cultivation, not only spreading and moving its escaped populations, but moving actually out from cultivated populations as well. This plant is fairly shade intolerant, so you'll find it mostly in disturbed areas, roadsides, old fields like that. We have the most problems with it in tree plantings, prairies, wet meadows, areas that that have a lot of sunlight is where we see this invading mostly. Wineberry is another one that I'm seeing spread around. So it's also called wine raspberry. It is a true raspberry species. So it's a multi-stemmed cane fruit. This one tends to have compound leaves in 3 to 5, but usually 3, with the terminal leaflet being much larger, very coarsely toothed, and the underside of the leaves are bright woolly white with hair. There's dense, straight, soft reddish thorns or hairs throughout the entire plant that really makes it stand out, kind of glandular tipped. And then the fruit are bright red or almost orange in color. You can see the underside of the leaf there, that's bright woolly white. You can see the straight, soft thorns, almost hair-like throughout the plant, and it does tend to have a reddish color to them. This is one that's been in the northeastern United States for a while, but we're seeing it spread now throughout the Midwest, and new populations pop up. It is still somewhat used as an ornamental, somewhat planted for food, but it does seem to spread into our forest and cause problems. I'm seeing it mostly in canopy gaps, forest edges, roadsides, or bluff tops. And the last one of these that I'll mention is Amur cork tree. So Amur cork tree is a large deciduous tree. It's often planted as an ornamental. It is dioecious. So there's male and female plants, though there has been some evidence of the male plants actually converting part of it and being able to produce fruit. But this is an opposite pinnately compound leaf, similar to an ash leaf, but the leaf base completely encircles the bud, so that looks a little different. The bark, as the tree ages, gets thick and corky, and if you peel it back and look at the underside or the inner bark tends to be a bright yellow or lime color, so that really stands out. And this one has fruit, so clusters of berries that are green and ripening to purple and black. So I always tell people it looks like an ash tree with berries. The bark can somewhat be mistaken for something like tree of heaven, but if you peel it back and you see that lime green or yellow color, it really stands out as well. But compound leaves, again, very much like an ash tree, but with fruit, and then tree of heaven like bark. Not a lot of populations, but we're seeing it move in Illinois right now, where I'm at, particularly in storm damaged areas. It seems to be spread by birds fairly quickly, moving around that way. So it's something that I think can respond very well to disturbance, can escape from cultivation fairly easily. So it's one definitely to keep an eye out on. And so those are just 5. I know we can mention others. I wanted to briefly go over them. And then Michael recommended reporting jumping worms to EDDMaps. I'm going to say the same thing for any new invasive plants. Reporting it to EDDMaps is probably one of the easiest ways to get the word out. People are looking for that. The other neat thing about EDDMaps, if you're not familiar with it, is that you can sign up and set up alerts. So you can have it email you whenever any new species are found in your area, or any any target species. There's a bunch of different ways to kind of create alerts, and it really helps identify new populations, or basically be able to respond fairly quickly. So that's that's a system or a feature of EdMaps that I think would be handy to use if you're really wanting to watch for new species that show up in your area. And with that, I'll happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. There we go. I have a question. Do you think that some of these expansions are just due to kind of like the opportunity that they were given, so like human movement and things like that? Or do you think that the expansion north is partially due to things like climate change and milder winters or longer growing seasons and things like that?
It's a good question. I think a lot of these plants have really not met their full potential of their range yet. You know, they were introduced either somewhat recently or they were introduced at one location, and they're basically slowly expanding their range until they reach their climatic edge where they just don't have suitable habitat anymore. My guess is we're still seeing that. So it's not as much climate change as it's just they're expanding to fill their potential niche and their range. Though I would imagine with climate change that that potential range that they can live in and suitable is ever changing for sure.
Right, for sure. All right. Just a comment that from Nadia, we have a Amur cork tree escaping in Hamilton area. So that would be in Ontario.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. You know, if even in Northern Illinois, like at the Morton Arboretum or some of these sites where they've had it planted for a long time, it kind of within the last 15, 20 years became one of their #1 problems in terms of it's a heavy seed producer. It spreads quickly, you know, through birds and other means, produces a ton of seed. And for us, it pops up in any kind of canopy disturbance. So yeah, unfortunately, I'm not surprised.
We do have a question, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to speak to this, but do you know of any regulations in place to stop and limit the distribution of invasive ornamental trees into Canada or to Canada?
I don't know about Canadian regulations,
Yeah.
right? So I do know that, you know, a lot of the states are assessing plants and adding them to regulated list. And then even the federal government with the United States has a kind of screening process for new species. I don't know what Canada has in place.
The Canadian Food Inspection Agency usually, I think, tackles kind of importation and if it is an ornamental tree being imported into Canada.
One of the challenges with that, though, is that a lot of these species are already in the trade. They're already being planted. So it's not assessing a new species as it is just recognizing that a previously used species are now becoming invasive. And that kind of ups the complexity of how to regulate those when they're kind of already on the landscape.
Absolutely. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. I think we will move on to the next presentation.
Thanks.
So next, it is my pleasure to introduce Eric Cleland, who will present Preparing Ontario for Landscape Scale Phragmites Management, an update from the Green Shovels Collaborative. Eric Cleland is the Director of the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Invasive Species Program for the Ontario region. Eric has over 20 years of experience in delivering habitat restoration and invasive species management programs within the government and not-for-profit sectors. Eric currently leads implementation of Canada's largest invasive Phragmites management program in the Long Point area, an initiative that pilots novel tools and techniques for control of the aggressive plant. He is a lead author of Ontario's new Frag Free by 2033 strategic framework as part of the Green Shovels Collaborative efforts and looks forward to an Ontario that is free from the impacts of invasive Phragmites. So Eric, you can go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Darissa.
It looks
how's everything
great.
look? Good?
Yep.
All right. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Invasive Species Forum. As Darissa mentioned, I'm Eric Cleland. I'm the Director of the Invasive Species Program here at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And I've had the pleasure of being part of the Green Shovels Collaborative through my role over the past year and a half or so. And we're working towards tackling what I'd like to call Ontario or even Canada's poster child invasive plant, invasive Phragmites. So today I'll share a little bit of information about our latest efforts under the Green Shovels Collaborative and our rather ambitious goal of becoming frag-free in Ontario by 2033. Just looking to advance the slides here. There we go. Okay, so who is the Green Shovels Collaborative? Well, really, we're a group of 6 conservation organizations that are very interested in the impacts invasive species are having on our natural environment. And you can see our core group there. We are Ducks Unlimited Canada, the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association, the Invasive Species Centre, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, alongside the Ontario Turtle Conservation Centre, and ourselves at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So a little overview of what Green Shovels has been up to. So about 18 months ago, the Green Shovels group got together and we put forward basically a menu of projects that were ready to go that would support invasive species management objectives, but also might align with some of the government's goals around stimulus, economic support, and job creation in the environmental sector. We were really fortunate and pleased to receive funding from the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry for a couple of critical projects. One was to develop this strategic framework for Ontario for managing Phragmites, but also some other work focused on developing some new tools for other invasive species. So today I'm going to stick to the focus on Phragmites, but if you'd like some more information about the other innovative tools that our Green Shovels team is working on, please do head over to our website, www.greenshovels.ca, to learn a little bit more about other opportunities for other species coming down the pipe. So why do we need an Ontario frag-free strategy? The reality is the province is plagued with Phragmites infestations, and it's impacting us not just from an ecological and biodiversity perspective, like those of us around our table are most focused on, but also it's impacting our agricultural partners, our municipalities and infrastructure across the province. And really what we hope to achieve is a coordinated and efficient approach to managing Phragmites. Right now, there are lots of fantastic hardworking projects going on across the province right now. And really what we've learned is there's an opportunity to bring those projects together in a collaborative fashion to have a truly landscape scale approach. And so our goal was to reach out as part of this initial program to describe the current state of Phragmites management in the province, develop this framework that includes providing guidance on how to set up those regional level models, those landscape models like NCC has been leading in the Long Point region. Very importantly, demonstrate the value of investing in Phragmites prevention and control. So what are the costs of action? And conversely, what are the costs of inaction for the province of Ontario? Also suggesting the communication and training needs. So if we're going to have a large province-wide provincial frag program, we're probably going to need to build some capacity. We're probably going to need to do some outreach and make sure the public is supportive and participating in the efforts. And also we need to continue to support the work that's ongoing. We've thankfully in many corners of Ontario made some great progress, and that's thanks to a lot of hardworking organizations and volunteers on the ground. So we did want to make sure we were able to continue to support those folks on an annual basis. So working towards building this Ontario strategy, we first needed to understand where exactly we were. And so a little over a year ago, we partnered with the Ontario Phragmites Working Group and the Ontario Invasive Plant Council to reach out to as many invasive Phragmites managers as we possibly could in Ontario. We used their annual general meetings. OIPC and OPWG helped facilitate a survey to all the frag practitioners, or fraggers as we call them in the industry, so to speak, to really ask all the questions of who's been doing what, how much it's costing, what's the scope of the work that they're doing, everything from the very small volunteer-led projects to the larger government-supported and funded programs, and what are the strengths and opportunities. So what's working and what isn't, and what are the gaps we need to help fill with the provincial strategy. We took a deep dive into 5 different significant projects in the province that were a varying scale of effort to really understand intimately the challenges that frag managers are facing in Ontario. And lastly, we summed it all up with some draft goals at the end of January in 2021 with a workshop, and invited all of those practitioners to that workshop to provide us with input and feedback and guidance to move forward to make sure that we get this framework correct. So what's in the draft framework? Well, we landed on 5 key goals as being most important. And the first goal that we heard most from folks across the province is we need to work together. Coordination and collaboration is critical to success. And whether it's governments or Indigenous communities or private landowners or environmental organizations, it really doesn't matter. To have a truly landscape scale and a complete impact on a geography, we need everybody at the table. In order to help guide that collaboration, we need to have a sustainable structure with a governance model in place. So we're proposing a model that has technical advice and liaison experts to help municipalities or regions build a program together and make sure that they're covering their bases and including all the people who need to be there to have a successful program. We also heard loud and clear that while many of us here today are all plant managers or working in the natural resources sector, many of the public still think Phragmites is that pretty grass growing in the ditch along the 401 highway. And we have a lot of work to do to educate people on the impacts of frag and what it's costing them both directly and indirectly. The second goal, which is probably the most exciting goal in the framework, is really the on-the-ground efforts, the prevention, the control, the monitoring aspects of it. So what steps do we need to take to prevent new introductions of Phragmites happening across our borders and to make sure that it's not escaping our borders into our neighboring provinces and states? What do we need to do to actually achieve more control on the ground? If we're going to ramp up these efforts, what type of capacity building is required? How do we support that? What are the training requirements, et cetera? And one of the bigger lessons we learned from reaching out to all of these frag managers was monitoring and how important that really is to tracking our progress. Without a uniform or a consistent monitoring method, we don't really know how to prepare a report card on an annual basis for how far we're tracking towards our frag-free status. So a very simple and easy to complete monitoring program would be critical to moving forward. Our third goal is program sustainability. Something else we heard loud and clear from a lot of fraggers across the province was having funding support to deliver their work is great, but really what they need is multi-year dedicated funding support so that the program isn't in jeopardy on an annual basis, so that they can plan for their contractors' needs a year in advance and make sure their staffing can be in place to help deliver projects. And if we're going to provide a multi-year funded program on the ground, then it's going to be important at a higher level, at the program administration level, that we explore all of the funding opportunities that are available to us, be it government sources, grants, or even innovative techniques like outcomes-based financing, for example. The fourth goal was removing barriers and making sure that we have an efficient process in place through policy and regulatory enhancements. We did hear from fraggers across the province that there are some barriers, including delays in approvals for things like letters of opinion or other permits and authorizations that are needed when working, particularly in sensitive habitats where Phragmites is often found. We want to make sure that we're getting the right guidance for things like species at risk when working in these sensitive habitats, but we also want to make sure we're receiving that guidance at the right time of year, that it doesn't actually impede activities from proceeding. So that's another important goal that the framework targets. And then lastly, continuing to position Ontario as a leader in Phragmites management through supporting research and innovation. The work that Michael Mctavish just spoke about through biological control agents is an excellent example of ways we want to make sure that we're working with the best science absolutely possible and ensuring that it guides all of our steps and directions moving forward. And so working towards incorporating our input and finalizing those documents. So those are the draft goals, and there's, 2 slides don't do justice to the 200 pages that we've prepared in the strategic framework, but really we're at that draft stage right now, and we've been seeking input over the summer and fall of 2021. We received input from fraggers across the province, and we're happy to hear more input if you have more thoughts on how to deliver the framework efficiently. My contact info will be at the end of this presentation. Currently, we're seeking input and refining based on thoughts from 4 key ministries who work together cooperatively on invasive species management initiatives through an interministerial working group. That's MTO, NDMNRF, OMAFRA, and MECP. We've been engaged directly with Environment and Climate Change Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service arm to gather their feedback as aggressive leaders in Phragmites management as well. We're taking the time to reach out to our Indigenous friends and partners in communities across Ontario and trying to apply a 2-eyed seeing approach to this document before it becomes finalized. We realize that Western science has guided a lot of the drafting to date, and the understandings and values of traditional Indigenous communities are critical and important. And they're a huge partner in delivering this work going forward. So ensuring a document that meets their needs and values as well is really critical. And then when it comes to actually delivering regional implementation programs on the ground in these sub-geographies of Ontario, we know municipalities are going to be a very important partner. So we're seeking feedback from municipalities right now to make sure that the document is a functional piece for them. So continuing on this idea of getting ready for implementation and being hopeful for an investment in a provincial Phragmites program, we're developing some tools to make it easier for practitioners across the province. Right now, myself and my colleagues at Green Shovels are working on the Regional Implementation Guidebook, modeling some of the landscape scale programs that the Nature Conservancy has been involved in across Ontario. And it'll have nuances that are specific to both northern and southern Ontario geographies, because we recognize the plant approaching management of this plant is very different depending on where you are in the province. We're currently developing an Indigenous engagement strategy to incorporate that traditional knowledge, not only into our documents, but into the planning and hopefully the partnerships in program delivery on First Nations lands across Ontario. We mentioned earlier the need for a communication strategy, so that's now in the works. We're working with some great consultants and some internal experts on how to do functional public education campaigns, how do we engage the public and citizen science efforts, what are the important industries that we need to target as potentials that could be either spreading or helping to control Phragmites as part of their daily activities as well. We're very pleased in 2021 to have been able to support over 20 different Phragmites projects on the ground with some of that funding from NDMNRF. And we're hoping that we'll receive continued funding going forward and be able to keep the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund moving in future years as well. And the last and one of the more exciting projects that we're working on as a great tool for our fraggers across the province is a DNA screening test that will be available in the coming months for fraggers who are just a little bit unsure whether they have the invasive variety of Phragmites or the native one, and want to make sure that they are being the most responsible frag managers that they possibly can and not impacting our native populations. So we're very pleased to offer 200 kits this year. Dollar signs are important. The reality is delivering a provincial strategy is not going to be cheap work. And a lot of our efforts in the last couple of months have been focused on gaining financial support from governments and foundations across the province. Currently, Green Shovels is developing a costed proposal to share with our friends at government with the hope for supporting an investment in coordinated management, even if it means a pilot project in 2022 or 2023. This funding support and proposal will include the staff that I mentioned earlier to support that on the ground coordination, the communications needs that we know we need, the administration of the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund, and general program oversight. If we are fortunate enough to receive financial support for a provincial frag program, we see three main bins or buckets that we could direct funds to. One being our municipal and infrastructure impacts that are happening, so supporting municipalities for their roadside costs, their municipal drains, their stormwater ponds, their vacant industrial lands that are being overtaken by frag. Supporting our friends in our Indigenous communities as well, to incorporate best management practices and align them with the values and interests of Indigenous communities, particularly where it's impacting traditional cultural practices or foods and medicines. And then lastly, we want to continue to support our fraggers on the ground, the folks who've got Ontario to where we are today, who are working in our wetlands and our shorelines and our beaches to make sure that they're healthy for our recreational needs and our watershed health. So stay tuned on the next steps for that support. It's a very exciting time for Phragmites management in Ontario, and we're very excited about what the future holds for managing this plant here. So with that, I'm going to come to the end of my presentation, but I will say we couldn't have done it without a great list of partners that you see here, the 6 members of the Green Shovels Collaborative, but we couldn't have done it without the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, the Ontario Phragmites Working Group, Janice Gilbert in the Invasive Phragmites Control Center, and Dr. Richard Vine from the University of Guelph's Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics Department. And with that, my last thank you is to all of you out there, the fraggers who are doing the work on the ground. You're the real soldiers in this war, so we really appreciate your efforts and know that this project wouldn't be possible without your support and dedication. Thanks very much, and my contact info is right there at the bottom if needed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. A lot of great comments. One comment and question. Great presentation, Eric. Really glad to hear that you're reaching out to First Nations partners in this work. Have any of the invasive Phragmites infestations in Ontario been linked to water treatment facilities? This has been an issue in some US states such as Minnesota and Wisconsin.
That's a great question. I actually honestly don't know the answer. It certainly is so prevalent across Ontario. I think there are many opportunities for spread, probably through a number of different industries or wastewater management programs. So I don't know. I think it's a possibility. The reality is we need all of those municipalities with those facilities on board supporting our control and management efforts for sure.
Absolutely. Another question, how is the work that you are doing supporting the Ontario Invasive Species Act in regards to Phragmites being a regulated species?
Well, unfortunately, the Invasive Species Act doesn't directly support management actions, but it is the guiding document. It is the regulatory piece that we need to work under. So following all of the guidelines and regulations that are found in that act are very important because we don't want to be part of the problem. We want to be the solution. So making sure that we're not spreading it in any ways or traveling with it because it is a restricted species is very important.
I have one question. Frag free by 2033, was that a strategically chosen date or was that for rhyming purposes and making it catchy?
It does rhyme really well, I do admit. We have put together a 10-year costed proposal, so we have a bit of an estimate in our costed plan that suggests by around 2033, with the right investment and all of the industries on board, it is an achievable goal. It could become a moving target realistically if funding isn't received, soon to launch the program. But the reality is a strong and dedicated effort over the next 10 years will make the difference. And I think what has allowed us to feel that way is really we have the tools available now in Ontario that we haven't had up until this year to begin controlling this plant. Herbicides, effective non-herbicide methods, the research has been done and we're really pleased to have the tools available now to achieve that goal.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric. In the interest of time, we are going to move to the next presentation. However, there is another question in the Q&A if you wouldn't mind just answering that
Sure.
with typing it. Awesome.
Thanks very
Thank you.
much.
Okay, to close out this session, please welcome Belle Bergner, who will speak to the North American Weed-Free Product Standards and Certification Program. Belle has been an executive, or the executive director of Nasma since 2016. During her tenure at Nasma, the organization has tripled its membership and has grown several major national and international programs that supports invasive species managers through consistent standards and trainings, resources, prevention tools, networking opportunities, and advocacy. Prior to Nasma, Belle was the conference administrator for the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference and ran a consulting business that provided grant writing and support services for the environmental nonprofit organizations. Belle has a master's from the University of Pennsylvania in ecology and evolution, and she lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where her and her husband, 2 kids, enjoy doing just about anything outside. Welcome, Belle.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. What great research and programs being discussed in this session. It's been really great to be a part of it.
Awesome.
So tell me, can you see, oh no, hang on, let me get my screen share going here. Okay, now let's do this.
Awesome.
Okay, perfect. All right, thanks again, Darissa, and thank you to the Invasive Species Center for organizing this really fantastic conference. So I'm going to talk about the Certified Weed-Free Products Program, but before I jump into that, for those who don't know NASMA, we are an international organization. Our mission is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America. We are 29 years young at this in this year. I can't believe it. And we have nearly 600 members and partner organizations across the US, Canada, and Mexico. We do a lot of different programs to serve that mission, including the international standards, one of which I'll talk about today, the Weed-Free Products Certification Program and Standards. We do education and advocacy out to the general public. National Invasive Species Awareness Week is coming up at the end of February. It's the February 28th through that first week in March. Stay tuned for great webinars. We'll do congressional briefings and a lot of outreach for that. Our Play Clean Go program, that is a really big program that provides prevention tools. We work cooperatively with the Council on Invasive Species in Canada on that program as well. Professional development, lots of different things there in the conference, our annual conference that'll be in November this year in Florida. So let's get into the Weed-Free Products Program. It started in 1993 with forage standards. It started with a group of Western County land managers that got together and realized they really needed to talk together to each other on a regular basis to make sure everyone is looking out for the same species, to be aware of, make sure they're not getting in the forage, and kind of started to put, set standards together so that everyone is following the same procedures for making sure the products that they're certifying are weed-free and they're following the same protocols. The goal of this program, it's a prevention program. So the goal is to ensure that noxious weeds are being controlled and not transported across jurisdictions. In 2006, gravel standards were added to the list of products that we certify and maintain standards for. And mulch standards were just approved in 2020, thanks to funding from USDA APHIS. And that is a growing market. As you know, that is a huge market, and there's a huge potential for the spread of weeds through that. So let's talk about a little bit more just big picture view of what the program does. It sets standards, and we have a committee that works, that gets together regularly to review and update those standards based on best practices. There's a process for adding weeds to the list of noxious weeds that are prevented in these certified products. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And again, it just provides a unified system that works across jurisdictional boundaries because, obviously these products are getting moved across states, across provinces. And as far as we know, this is the only international standards program for these products and for these pathways of spread. It really does rely on cooperation between jurisdictions to make sure that they are following the same procedures, but we do have a training program that I'll talk about that provides the same consistent training on how to implement the standards. So, and it's, last bullet is, the goal is to build positive public-private relationships. Our government, our county and provincial and state inspectors are, everyone's goal is the same, to protect our special natural areas from the spread of weeds. So big overview of how the certification program works, and then I'll get a little bit into the details of the training and standards. So how it works is a government unit signs a memorandum of understanding with us. I'll talk in the next slide, I'll talk about who is authorized in our program to do that. They agree to uphold these standards. I'm realizing that orange bullet, we need to add mulch to that. So they can choose whether they're going to be responsible for and have their inspectors do forage and or gravel and or mulch. They can choose one or all three or a combination, whatever combination they are prepared to do. Then they have their inspectors go through our certification training. It's an online system, although we do have some states, for example, Alberta does their own in-person training. And then there's a certificate of inspection that is given once an inspector completes the training and passes the test successfully. And then there are transit certificates that the MOU holders are responsible for using when those products are certified. Okay, that's a high-level overview. Let's get into the details again. So we're just going to go step by step through the process. Most of the sort of architecture of the program is the same, whether your government agency is wanting to do forage or gravel or mulch. I'll talk about the subtle differences in a little bit between the programs. So an MOU is signed. This is the first page of it. And again, so here are the designated authorities that can be that are allowed in our program to sign the MOU. It can be a state agency. And so the determination of who does this largely is based on how your province or state is organized. So some states or provinces defer to an outside association to do it. For example, in the state of Wisconsin, where I am, the Wisconsin Crop Improvement Association is the entity that is authorized by our state Department of Agriculture to be responsible for holding the standards and training inspectors. In some cases, it's counties. It's just individual counties. The state defers to the county, or the province defers to the county. In some cases, it's just an individual county. It could be any other government authority. The one requirement right now, the way our program is set up, is it does have to be a government authority. Okay, then the entity that signs the MOU instructs us, sends us a list of who their inspectors are going to be that are going to sign up for the online training. That in the past has happened at our annual conference. We've moved to a system where it's online and can be done on demand at any time. Nasma, again, so through the MOU, Nasma approves which state or province or local entity is responsible for, making sure that the right inspectors are the ones doing the training, et cetera. And then there's a 2-year certification fee of $40 per inspector. Here is our current map of our current weed-free product MOU holders. Some of these states are certified for all 3 products. Some are just 1 or 2. It really is just dependent on what the state and province is set up and prepared and has the funding to do. So we've got a great list here. Really excited that last year Alberta joined us. And let's see what, I just want to point out, just to make sure it's clear, California is the one state that defers to counties, individual counties, to decide if they want to participate. So the state says, yes, we're great with this program. This is great, but we're, as a state agency, we're not going to manage this. Each individual county can sign an MOU and go through the whole process. All right, so we have minimum standards. Each, whether it's forage, gravel, or mulch, there is a different form, but the components of that form is, or of the standards that is signed, is basically the same. There are definitions of each term that's used in the standards. There are minimum standards. There's a recommended list of supplies. There's a prohibited species list that I'll talk about in a minute. There's a certificate of inspection that must be filled out during the inspection. There's a transit certificate, and then there are markings that are allowed or intended, or designed to be used for the product once it's when it's certified as weed-free. Here is our list of Nasma's prohibited weeds. This list started with Western states, and as we've moved eastward, the process of adding species is this. So each individual state that is an MOU holder or province is invited to suggest additional species are added to this list. That goes through sort of an internal process with our committee and then approved at our annual general meeting. However, in the standards, it also states that you, as an MOU entity, are responsible for maintaining this list, making sure these species are not in the products you're certifying, and you can add your own local list. So you don't have to add the species of concern in your area. It is stated in our agreement that we defer to you to determine what are the important species. You can state that you have your own provincial or state list that you will make your certified inspectors use when they do inspections. So I'm going to focus on mulch since that's the most recent standards and certification training program we have. But again, the process of training is very similar. The goal is we want mulch that is weed-free rather than potentially stilt grass or garlic mustard laden, with seeds from those or other species. So the standards are designed to show when and how to inspect mulch. It shows information to be included on the inspection certificate, and it provides assurance to everyone involved that a minimum acceptable standards have been followed for that product to ensure that the noxious weeds are not being spread. The goal is, again, to help protect natural resources, wildlife, agricultural resources, et cetera, and prevent the transportation of these weeds across jurisdictional boundaries. We talk in the standards about how the goal is providing, making sure that the minimum treatment is used, and inspectors are trained to make sure that the minimum treatment is used to prevent the spread. Mulch is, as I said, it's used in so many different ways: post-fire site stabilization, roadside use, erosion control, soil stabilization, weed suppression. It's used on public lands, private lands. It is an enormous industry. We worked cooperatively with the Soil and Mulch Council that's based here in the US on these standards because they had their own standards that we wanted to make sure meshed with how they train their inspectors. I'm going to breeze over these standards really briefly, but they are online on our website. So you can download the entire minimum standards document. You can look at the MOU. It's all there on the website. So a lot of this I've already covered. I'll just run through these real quick. Minimum standards are that the inspected area is inspected, or the inspected area is free of prohibitive weeds. There's a set process for the standards, and there's an assurance that the treatment and storage is preventing the addition of new weeds. So basically the standards instruct that the mulch is inspected in the area of origin by the designated entity, the MOU entity, or an authorized inspector of that entity. It ensures that weeds are treated, And there are in some cases where the area of origin of the mulch, could be out in a forest, next to a forest somewhere. It's not where the mulch is being stored and set for distribution. There are other approved processes that the standards and training goes through. There's a minimum standard of 90% greater, that the mulch size is a minimum 90% greater than 2 millimeters in particle size in order not to supplant plant growth, because of course, in many cases, mulch, you don't want it to totally supplant plant growth, or 10% is less than 2 millimeters in particle. Temperature, there's a minimum temperature of the pile that ensures that seeds are not encouraged to grow and that it kills any weed seeds. So there's a process of documenting the requirements and that they're ensuring that they are met with reasonable and prudent inspection protocols. And the shipment of the mulch product has to be accompanied by marking, and there's a specificity of what that marking can be. The specificity of mulch is a little bit different than gravel and forage. Because of the nature of the product, there's some flexibility depending on what's being transported. There's a certificate of inspection. You can use our template as long as the main components of the certificate are on yours. You can use your own form, but there are some minimum fields that need to be in there to ensure that the minimum standards are being met. There are appendices in the standards that show, again, what that prohibited species list is, and specification that your local list can be added if you have your own noxious weed list. There are standard requirements, certificate of inspection minimum requirements, again, the markings, and then the guidelines for field inspections are in that appendices. So with that, I want to give a special thanks to our mulch standards subcommittee members who spent a lot of time helping to make sure that this will work for the industry. And I should have put a slide here of our full weed-free products committee members. So this standards subcommittee reports to the larger weed-free products committee, and we'd love to have new members join us and be a part of ensuring that this process and program will work for where you live. We absolutely recognize, as we moved eastward in particular, the way that invasive species are regulated and managed is very different. It can be very different. There's different funding structures, there's different levels of authority, even working within or between state governments and federal governments, there can be very different expectations of who's responsible. So we're working to provide flexibility in this program, depending on what your province or local area, how you're set up, with your laws and regs. And with that, I will thank you for having me here. Again, our mission is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America. And I want to give you my contact information there. There's my email. Please reach out if you have questions. And Elizabeth Brown also, it helps to provide oversight on this program. She was very instrumental in the mulch program development in particular. So please reach out if we don't have time to get to all of the questions today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Belle. We only have a quick minute for questions. When you say gravel, is that referring to all aggregates and soils?
Yeah, all aggregates. Good question, not soil. Yep.
Okay. And do the mulch standards incorporate conditions that would discourage the transport of jumping worm cocoons?
Oh, good question. I would have to defer to our committee. I know there was a lot of discussion on that. So I'm not sure if the heat treatment is sufficient. I don't know that there is specificity in that language. Great question. I don't know, type your email in chat and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, Erica, maybe if you can send Belle an email. Her email is up on the slide. And then I believe we'll also post all of the speakers' emails in the chat for anyone who has follow-up questions and is looking for more information on any of the presentations. So that's it. We are going to conclude this session. Thank you so much, Belle, and thank you to all of our presenters. Before we do break for lunch, I have a few announcements, and Belle actually touched on one of them. So please mark your calendars for the 2022 Invasive Species Awareness Week campaign, February 28th to March 4th, 2022. You can get involved by just liking, sharing, and retweeting posts on social media created by participating organizations, or by creating your own posts using the hashtag Invasive Species Week during ISA. Visit the Invasive Species Center website under upcoming events for more information on that. Please join us after lunch for the keynote plenary session with speakers Nick Modrak and Robert Boucher, beginning at 1 p.m. All right, and with that, I'll let everybody break for some food. Have a great day.